The coming of the Civil War in History 1301 is a series of events, mile markers or signposts, if you like, a series of events, however, that really culminate and start around the time of the war with Mexico and culminate with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 and the bolting of the Union, or the declaration of secession from the Union by South Carolina in late December of 1860. You have a number of events that in isolation probably would not have brought on the Civil War. However, yet in a community or bound together, they help ratchet up the pressure time and time again that caused basically both sides to come to the conclusion that war was inevitable, secession was going to happen, and what do you do about it? So we start our discussion today with those signposts and those mile markers on the road to the American Civil War. The thing is to keep in mind is that kind of some general principles on this road to the Civil War is the issue of slavery. I teach it this way. I'm pretty much in the mainstream on this one, I'd say. But the issue of slavery as the chief cause of the Civil War is, without a doubt in my mind, is the thing. As the years march by from the 1840s to the 1850s to the fateful year of 1860, even 1861, the fact of the matter is that when we talk about the coming of the Civil War, you really see both the Southern perspective on slavery and at least a abolitionist perspective in the North on slavery start to harden. For Southerners, especially the plantation class that really rule the South to some degree or another, they are in full accord and agreement that slavery is an indispensable part of life. It is the basis by which they are going to make a lot of money in the cotton trade, as we've already discussed. And on top of that, as the years march by toward 1860, you see more and more Southerners, especially the elites and the real what is called fire eaters. You probably need to write that word down, a fire eater. The real fire eaters are going to say that slavery isn't just okay, it's a positive good. But beyond that, slavery cannot be inhibited anywhere. Slavery cannot be stopped and hemmed in wherever it is found. Because one of the things that was kind of in the old compromises and is kind of understood by many people prior to the fateful years before the Civil War was that slavery was going to exist in places like Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Tennessee, maybe even Arkansas, or certainly Arkansas. But frankly, slavery would need to be hemmed in, and slavery would not extend north of that 3630 parallel from the old Missouri Compromise. It would not extend north into the old Northwest Territory. It would not extend north into the upper reaches of the Louisiana Purchase, and certainly not to the West Coast. There was never really an appetite in California for slaves or slavery to any degree in its early days. But that consensus, and it was a consensus early on in the 19th century between North and South, that the South was going to have slavery, but it would not be messed with and it would stay south of that line, starts to erode from the Southern perspective, certainly by the late 1840s. You start to see, and especially in the 1850s, you see this fire eater faction in Southern politics start arguing vociferously, emotionally, and with reasons that basically say that slavery must be allowed to extend to wherever it needs to go, because slavery isn't nothing to apologize for. So they are attempting to remove the moral angle to it. Slavery is good for society in the form of economics, and on top of that, you do not get penalized for taking your horse from say Alabama to Iowa, or Alabama to Illinois, or some other free state. Why should you be penalized? And on top of that, slavery isn't just good, it's good for the whole of America. We need more slaves in a sense. And going all the way toward the end of the 1850s, you'll see some of the more crazy fire eaters, the more wild-eyed fire eaters like an Edmund Ruffin, start to talk about we need to reopen the international slave trade, that the crying need of America isn't just an expansion of slavery, but more slaves. There was a radicalness that you find there. that on the northern side, also in the early days, there was an allowance for slavery. And in fact, actually, when you look at, say, somebody like an Abraham Lincoln, you find him even into the 1850s trying to basically say, if you keep slavery where it is, we'll let it be. We're not going to go, but we will not allow for slavery to expand into further reaches. We are not going to allow slavery to expand into New York State or to Illinois, his Illinois. That's not to say those states were particularly enlightened on the race issue. If you actually look at Illinois, it's not. But at the same time, it's one thing to be somewhat unreconstructed, as they used to say it. Another thing is to allow slaves. The Northerners said basically, we are fine with slavery where it is, but it cannot get beyond that. And so, as Southerners are going to push for the slavery to expand, Northerners are still uncomfortable with it, and frankly, many Northerners, not a majority, but many Northerners think of slavery as an abject evil. Those would be, say, your abolitionists, and would say it has to be tightly controlled, and even those who would go further still, the real radicals, the radical abolitionists, would say slavery must be ripped out root and branch. So all that to put together is that you start to see these two factions form up in the United States between those who are without reservation, radical factions, without reservations about the goodness of slavery and the expansion of the institution. On the other hand, those who are without reservation saying at the least it has to be contained, if not at the most ripped out root and branch. It cannot be allowed to go. And a lot of Southerners basically started to come beyond the radical fringes. By the time you get to 1860, a lot of Southerners are going to come back to that idea of if you control our slaves and if you refuse to let slavery expand, you're going to eventually be able to curtail us and take it away from us where it is. We can't allow this to happen. There's a whole lot of issues wrapped up into this. Frankly, even free land, the idea of what do you do with land on the Great Plains, like Kansas and Nebraska. As Ben Wade of Ohio once said, do you give the land to the landless or or does the land go to the slaves, rather the slave owner, or let me see how he says it exactly. It's a question of whether land to the landless or slave to the slaveless. What do you want? And so, anyways, this is a contentious issue. Lots of ink will be spilled. Obviously, lots of blood will eventually be spilled in this war, and even before the war, you'll have blood spilled. This is an issue that just simply, at times, maybe never could have been handled or resolved in any other way, but through violent emancipation, violent destruction of the institution of slavery. I've come to that conclusion that probably that was the only way it was going to happen in the United States. Unlike Mexico, which was able to get by with emancipating their slaves, which they never had a lot of in their history, you don't have the same sort of painful, argumentative, but yet largely peaceful emancipation of slaves like you have in England, say with William Wilberforce, or even down in Martinique in the old French colonies. All that to say is we're headed for a conflagration, a fight, a civil war, and it's going to be a nasty affair of the first order. It is what it is. So here we go. So I guess you could say the first road marker, the first mile markers, signposts on the road to the Civil War is going to be found during the war with Mexico itself. Obviously, I kind of left off in the last lecture of discussing the issue of the Civil War, or rather the war with Mexico, and how it kind of sows the seeds or fertilizes the seeds, or whatever the exact expression was, for the Civil War. The question, of course, arises, what do you do with that land? And it was fairly naked. Sometimes Polk's administration would try to cover up and kind of, put on a fig leaf of why are we fighting this war. But it was fairly naked that the United States was fighting the war with Mexico to acquire some territory. How much that changes over the course of the war, but what do you do with the territory? Now, that's the question. What do you do with the territory once you acquire it? And remember, you're going to pick up a lot of land. Do you allow slavery into Oregon? Do you allow slavery into California? I know what I said a minute ago about slavery in California never really got off the ground, but that doesn't mean you can't introduce it. It takes root, and then now you got it. So what do you do with that land? Well, you entered into your notes a name. The man's name is David Wilmot, Wilmot. David Wilmot is an obscure congressman from Ohio, and he is going to introduce on a sleepy, sultry summer night in the Congress, I believe it was in 1846, may have been 47. The Congress, especially the House of Representatives, was debating the issue of paying for the war. It was an appropriations bill, nothing more, nothing less. Polk had done his level best with regard to the issue of slavery to keep the issue of slavery out of the war with Mexico. Basically, don't talk about it, ignore it, simply do not attach the war to the acquisition of land plus the introduction of slavery. Basically, that he understood, and most people understood, that that could be a killer. It could arouse sentiment against the war that was already there, sometimes outspoken, sometimes latent. All that to say is that all these issues are present. But Polk had basically needed money for the war. You're going to fight this war, you got to pay for it. We're familiar with that. And the Polk administration had put forward some appropriations bills in the House of Representatives and in the Senate to help pay for the war. And so that's all they are. They're just basically money bills. Well, David Wilmot, who was up to this point in time and really nothing more than just a kind of a backbench congressman, stands up and basically adds a rider to the bill that says the appropriations bill paying for the war. A rider is an amendment that basically says no new, all this new land will not be open to slave expansion. And that was the rolling of the proverbial hand grenade into the men's room, and everybody scatters. The House erupts, and it's, like I said, it's a sleepy nighttime session. Sleepy because it's hot and drowsy and nobody's paying attention. Yet at the same time, all of a sudden, this happens, and oh my, what are we going to do? How's this going to work out? The House was dominated in 1848 or so, 47, by Northerners because of the population components of the administration of the House, the basic mechanics of the House of Representatives. And so in 1847, 48, the Northerners voted through. There is acrimony, there is heated words, and in some respects as heated as what you got in the 1819, 1820 saga that creates the Missouri Crisis. In some respects because it is directly touching on the issue of slavery rather than the issue of nullification and secession like the crisis of 1833 was there. The fact of the matter is that when you talk about this, in some respects, this was even more germane to the issue of slavery when it's all said and done. So anyways, the House passes it. The Senate does not. It doesn't get anywhere. But for a lot of folks, this was the proverbial fire bell on the night, as Jefferson referred to the Missouri Crisis. What do you do with this land that's going to be acquired? And so people try to sweep it under the rug, play happy, nice, but yeah, that's not going to happen. So that question is, what do you do with it? And so eventually you're going to have to answer the question, even if you want to avoid it, even if you want to whistle past the proverbial graveyard, any other cliche I can think of or analogy. Well, the war ends, and Polk leaves office in 1849, dies shortly thereafter, as I said, and the man who replaces him is Zachary Taylor let me think a second, he's got land in Louisiana, he's got plantations in Louisiana, but I think also in Kentucky. All that to say is Zachary Taylor is a Whig, so he's not a Democrat. He's a general and a war hero, and the Whigs feel like, well, here we go again, we are back in business. But actually, it's worth noting, too, for your dining and dancing pleasure, is that Zachary Taylor was acceptable to many Southerners. Because Zachary Taylor was not just some sort of career military man, poor and a creature of the Army. He was a military man. He was a creature of the Army to a degree. But when you talk about old Zach Taylor, he was also a wealthy man who had plantations in Louisiana, and he had more than a few slaves. He would be considered planter class. So the Whigs, in a sense, thought they had it all. They could eat their cake and have it at the same time. On the one hand, we got a guy who's one of us. He's a Whig, even if he didn't always vote very often, if ever. The fact is, however, he's a Whig, and so that, salves the Southerners, Southern Whigs, so they like him. Maybe you were able to attract Southern Democrats, because, not all, of course, but maybe those on the fence. Because in 1848, Polk was not all that popular, and the Democrats were kind of in a bit of I say eclipse, but certainly they were in the doldrums. And so you were able to draw in some Southerners who were slave owners or who had hoped to be slave owners, because certainly, a man like Zach Taylor is not going to be against slavery because he's one of us. Northerners could look at that, and Northern Whigs could swallow hard because of politics, and he's a pretty good candidate. And when it's all said and done, Zach Taylor wins fairly handily in 1848 and is inaugurated in 1849. But the events are going to conspire against him. Taylor is going to have his problems. And frankly, the country is going to be faced with the issue that they would rather not be faced with. What do you do with all that land you just picked up from Mexico out of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo? Well, the answer is going to be, we are going to have to fight it out once more. And the reason is that California is growing in an exponential fashion. Now, most of you are familiar with football. Some of you are very familiar with pro football. And more still, if you think about the Super Bowl this past this past Super Bowl in early 2020, the team that was playing, there were two teams obviously playing in the Super Bowl, one of which is the Kansas City Chiefs, who won the game, and then, of course, the San Francisco 49ers. And that name, 49ers, is an allusion and a reference to a historical fact in California history. That in the year 1849, there was a great land rush, and more particularly a great gold rush to California. Because in 1848 at Sutter's Mill, there was discovered gold in California, and people are crawling all over themselves to get there to get rich. And seemingly, frankly, when it comes to gold mines, the only people who got rich are the ones who sold supplies, whether it was food or mining supplies. Most people got out there and didn't make any money, other than they lost whatever money they had. But people are moving to California. California's filling up. I don't mean 30 million fill up or 45, 50 or whatever they are today, but I do mean they are filling up. That California has lots of people in it, and that California is now ready for statehood. And so that begs the question, what are you going to do when you introduce California into the Union? Are you going to introduce them as a free state, or are you going to introduce them as as a slave state or whatever, because it threatens to upset the precarious balance in the United States Congress and the United States Senate? Well, all that is to say is that this is the bomb in the men's room that goes back off again, and more people are scattering, and what do? Well, a lot of Southerners thought that Zachary Taylor would be conducive to a Southern argument because of his ownings of slaves, but they didn't take into account that while he owned slaves, he was not a committed Southerner on the issue of slavery. He's not against slavery, obviously, but he's not a fire breather. The fire eaters weren't existing in 1850, but at the same time, or not at least in any numbers that are noteworthy. But at the same time, Zach Taylor's not a Southern fellow traveler. Well, anyways, as the year 1850 starts to unfold, the issue of California and admission of California into the Union is taking greater and greater importance. The problem the Southerners have and the slave owners have is that if you look around, there are not any good answers to the arithmetic of how do you balance California out. Unlike 1820, where you had Missouri come in as a slave state and then Maine balanced Missouri out in the admission process, if you look around in 1850, there's no other state, or rather no other territory ready to be made that was ready-made for slave and slave-holding states. So the balancing issue is going to be really hard to cut. So there was some discussion in 1850 of splitting Texas into multiple states to balance. Texas is, of course, a very big state, but what do you do there? If you go westward out toward New Mexico and Arizona, that is certainly not conducive land to cotton, and it's not conducive land to slavery, and it is entirely questionable that any slave owners would go out there anyhow. Let alone the fact the local population of those territories aren't big, but they're not excited about the issue of slaves. So all that to say is that geographically the Southerners are kind of pinned at that point in time. So California wants to come in. Southerners are in a tizzy. The battle lines are drawn, and enter the equation for essentially the final time, the old bulls of the United States Senate. Those men are John Calhoun of South Carolina, who by this point in his life is dying. He's an old man. He's decrepit. He may have cancer. I don't remember which, but he is dying. And Calhoun is going to basically push the issue of sectionalism, and that's what he was at this point in his career. In addition to that, you're going to see Daniel Webster, who is the known orator of the United States Senate. He, too, is in old age. I don't mean decrepit like 85 or 90, but he's certainly not long for the world, and memory serves as he dies within a year of this compromise of this 1850 crisis. And so then, of course, Henry Clay, who himself now is in the Senate from Kentucky, plus a whole bunch of others. And Clay looks upon this as his last chance to help save and bridge the Union for another maybe 30 years. Because if you remember closely, it was Henry Clay in 1820, 30 years before, who had, in 1819, 1820, it was Henry Clay who had cobbled together the Compromise of 1820 that acted as a really good Band-Aid, obviously didn't heal the thing, but a Band-Aid to keep the country from flying apart and welded together over the issue of slavery, territorial expansion, and so forth. And so Henry Clay steps in and says, all right, how can we put this together? And this is in the summer of 1850, so keep that near the back of your mind. For those of you from Houston, you're going to laugh at what I'm going to say next. But Washington, D.C. in the summer is an unpleasant place to be. Some of you may have lived up there, maybe gone visiting, walked the mall back when you could do that sort of thing before the virus is which caused this recording to happen. The fact of the matter is that Washington, D.C. in the summertime is hot, humid, disagreeable, unpleasant. You don't want to be there. So anyways, D.C. is D.C. And remember this, in 1850, there is no such thing as air conditioning. So you may not have ever noticed this because we Texans value our air conditioning dearly. I always joke in class, if Texas did not have air conditioning, most people would move out of Texas in a heartbeat and they'd be moving back to Illinois or to Wisconsin, but not Texas. Well, anyways, all that to say is that you Houstonians think that maybe Texas has got it beat and it's Houston in the summertime is unpleasant. I agree. I've walked out of many of Minute Maid Park games and thought, my gosh, this is oppressive and humid and nasty at 10 o'clock and it's 92 degrees. Washington, D.C. can be a lot like that. So the reason I bring up the weather is it just adds to the drama, it adds to the perspiration, it adds to the short tempers that can emerge in these debates around what's going to be known as the Compromise of 1850. So you get all this stuff to build up and all this stuff to grow up here. And so Henry Clay goes from one group to the next and one here to there and so forth. And Henry Clay is trying to put together what's known as an omnibus bill, which basically is a big bill, a kind of a omni, meaning many or big, bill that is going to basically try to cut the knot of how do we make the Southerners swallow California and not blow the country up. It's really precarious. The problem is that this omnibus bill, just the vehicle that Clay tried to use just was not working. Southerners couldn't accept every part of it. Northerners couldn't accept the sop to the Southerners and what have you. And so the United States Congress, especially the U.S. Senate, because this is where the real action was, because that's where the senators, from the South had their greatest impact and influence. Remember, the House is going to be able to vote whatever the northern section wants. The Senate is in deadlock effectively throughout the summer, and then God or fate, probably depends on your version of what that means or what you believe, but one or the other intervene. We know what kills the man, but all I'll say is that President Zachary Taylor is not long for the world, because on July 4th, 1850. President Zachary Taylor had attended a July the 4th celebration. I'd like to say it was at the Washington Monument. And then after the celebration was over, he retires and goes back to the White House for a lazy afternoon in the White House on a hot, sultry day in Washington, D.C. Because if it was normal operating procedure, most people would have decamped from Washington and gone to the New Jersey shores, upstate New York, the Adirondacks, or maybe somewhere in Pennsylvania, certainly the mountains of Maryland, just not there where we're not in Washington, D.C. But as you well know, on a hot and sultry day, nothing tastes as good as ice cream or cold fruit. And the way the story goes is that President Taylor engorged himself on both cold cream and cherries, I believe it was. But anyways, whatever it was, one of those was laced with salmonella, I believe it was, or listeria. It's food poisoning is my point. And within about 2 days, President Taylor was sick and then dead. And so the man who replaces Zachary Taylor is I call him milquetoast. And sometimes that's unfair on my part, but to look at him, he looks like he's an agreeable sort, maybe the sort of man that would sign something if it dropped onto his desk. The fact of the matter is the man who replaces Zach Taylor is Millard Fillmore. And Millard Fillmore is much more agreeable than Zach Taylor. And part of the reason that Zach Taylor was a surprise is that Zach Taylor was looking for a clean admission of California in the Union. Zach Taylor was not particularly interested in salving the wounds of upset Southerners or having Clay's omnibus bill. And so when the President of the United States kind of throws his weight against something, makes it all the harder to move a bill through Congress than is now. But Millard Fillmore is far more agreeable. In fact, actually, some might have called him a dough-faced politician. Might ought to write that down. A dough-faced politician is an individual, or dough-faced northerner, as the name might imply, is a man who is very amenable and very malleable in the hands of a southerner. A southerner or a group of southerners can get a hold of this guy and they can mold his face to make this northerner look like a southern lackey. You'll see several presidents in this era who they themselves are very malleable, very dough-faced. And so that was the first crack in the levee. So you're going to start to see the move. Basically, you're going to start to see the legislation start to move. But the omnibus bill was still a problem. Enter into your notes a new name. This man's nickname is the Little Giant. He is a young man in the Senate in this time period. His name is Stephen Douglas. Now, Stephen Douglas of Illinois. Stephen Douglas of Illinois was 5'4". He's 5'4". He's a short man. He's kind of quirky in his habits. He's very brilliant. He knows it. He thinks you should tell him that too. And on top of that, he has the strange habit, even for the time period, of jumping in other senators' laps and almost acting like a little boy talking to these aged senators. It's endearing to some and off-putting to others, but it is this moment here where Stephen Douglas comes into his own and comes into the national prominence in trying to settle the issue of the Compromise of 1850. What Douglas does is, it's a really canny move politically, is he breaks apart the bill and then starts to get the Senate to vote through on one issue here and one issue there and one bill there and what have you. Is ultimately what you get is the Compromise of 1850, but not as an omnibus, but broken apart. It was a masterful move, and it was in a sense the passing of the torch and the passing of the guard from Henry Clay and his generation to the third generation, or maybe fourth even, but certainly the next generation of leaders and prominent individuals in American political history. So what happens? The Compromise of 1850 is going to extend the 3630 parallel all the way out to California. That's a sop to the Southerners. So, okay, well, can you get anybody to live out there? No, probably not, but at this point in time, who knows what will happen in the future. That Indian Territory might turn into a state, say Oklahoma. But right now, we're going to move that line westward all the way out to the border with California. California will be admitted as a free state. In addition to that, you're also going to see Texas be dealt with in the Compromise of 1850. Some of you are familiar with the look of Texas prior to 1850. Texas had this chunk of land that stretches all the way through eastern New Mexico, all the way up into very southern Wyoming. But Texas was convinced give up her claims to that land all the way out to essentially Santa Fe, New Mexico, up to Wyoming. And Texas is going to take the form that you know her today, with the Panhandle, the Dive, and then all the way the Trans-Pecos West out to El Paso. What Texas traded with land is we gave the federal government that land, and they gave us, or rather, we gave the land to the federal government, and they assumed the debt from the old Republic of Texas, and that was that. So that was the deal there. One of the other real sop to the Southerners was a strengthened federal Fugitive Slave Act. And that's going to be one of those also mile markers in signposts, because that was going to really agitate Northerners. The fact that you will have U.S. Marshals and other bounty hunters running through northern cities and northern territories, arresting and pulling back to the south runaway slaves, some of whom had recently run away, others who had maybe lived in Massachusetts for 10 or 15 or 20 years. Well, anyways, point is this, is that federal slave act is going to be a real thorn in the side for Northerners, and it just makes them buck and pitch, and it's going to cause a lot of hard feelings. A lot of civil resistance, too, so I guess you could say that would be a mile marker in a sense itself. But you pass this Compromise of 1850, it gets out, and many people think, well, the issue is settled. Now we can go on with life. Let's move on. Whistle past the graveyard. Status quo ante, meaning as it was before. Back to normal. You hear that a lot. Why can't we just go back to the way it was? Well, sometimes you just can't. Sometimes the circumstances and the people and whatever else is at play won't allow that to happen. So, but the Compromise of 1850 is there. The president is Millard Fillmore. He signs it. Like I said, he's kind of a milquetoast individual. And it's worth noting now that in the coming of the Civil War, one of the things that might have prevented it, or at least might have been able to untie the knot, if it was ever untiable, regarding slavery and how to either live with it or not, because the Civil War is going to cost 660,000 lives. In a much, much smaller United States. So people can say, well, it was good we fought the war, but that's pretty easy to say sitting here in 2020 saying, well, I'm glad all those people died, and look back. I don't think those folks then really wished for 660,000 or whatever the exact number was. What I mean by that is only God himself actually knows the exact number of dead in the war. But all that to say, though, is that the presidential leadership in the 1850s is garbage. When the country needed leadership, they got none. You had a devolving, receding quality of leadership. You go from Zach Taylor, who was probably mediocre as a president, to Millard Fillmore, who was below average. And then the next person up is Franklin Pierce, who's bad. And then last but not least, James Buchanan in the late 1850s is absolutely garbage. So you had bad presidents. Like I say, when the country needed leadership and quality leadership, they got crap. As I sometimes talk about Lincoln in context with the people around him, meaning his peers as a president. Lincoln was a diamond dropped in the middle of a dunghill. So whatever you want to say it, presidential leadership is bad. So anyways, in 1852, you're going to have the next step on the road to the Civil War. In 1852, you're going to see an election, obviously, and that election is going to be who replaces Millard Fillmore. Millard Fillmore was not conducive to being a man who's president. He's just not going to work out that way. He's not good. And Millard Fillmore stands aside, and the Democrats cast about, and I'm really interested in the Democrats because they're going to cast about and they are going to find their perfect candidate. At least they thought he was perfect because, well, he was not tainted by the Compromise of 1850. He's not tainted by the issues of slavery. He's not tainted by all the controversies. He'd been out of public life. He was kind of what you could say dough-faced, and they will call him dough-faced in his presidency. But he was certainly an untouched man in a sense. On top of that, he's a war hero. He fought in the war with Mexico and was decorated. So you got the perfect world here. You got a great guy. Now, the problem with Franklin Pierce, and that's his name, the problem with Franklin Pierce is that old Frank Pierce had been out of politics not because of forced retirement by the voters, but he got out of politics because of forced retirement by his wife. And what was her name? not Sarah Childress, Jane Pierce, I believe her name was. But anyways, all that to say is that when you talk about Franklin Pierce, so if you hear anything in the background, I'm having some welding work done right now. But if you talk about Franklin Pierce, his wife is going to basically say to him, honey, this is in the 1840s now. He had been a senator from New Hampshire. So there he is. He's a northerner. He's a New Hampshire man. And she basically says, honey, come home. The thing to remember about Mrs. Pierce is that she is a devout Calvinist. I think she was Presbyterian. You can check the denomination for me. I'm not worried about that particularly, but I am worried enough to know that to bring up that issue of Calvinism once more. Just because you're talking politics doesn't mean religion doesn't have a part to play. And in the form of Calvinism that you remember from the Puritans or others like them is a very rigid, at times a very sovereign God who is demanding. He's no Santa Claus. He's no doting uncle, kind of a befuddled grandfather figure that sometimes you get with more watered-down versions of God. No. The Calvinist understanding of God is that He is in control, omnipotent, omniscient, omni-everything. He selects, He elects, He chooses, and you need to toe the line. He believes in holiness and so forth. And Jane's version was a very hardcore, hard shell, very hyper Calvinist idea. So, I mean, you take Calvinism, which can be in a sense very hard, but you make it harder still. And Jane in the 1800s or 1840s, went to her husband and said, honey, I believe that God wants you to come home. I believe God wants you to practice the law. I believe that God wants you to leave the Senate because ambition is going to ruin our family. She was concerned mightily that the ambition of her husband was running counter to the will of the Lord. And that because of that, he was playing with fire. The Pierces had 3 children. Frank and Jane had I keep on saying it's Jane, but Sarah Childress. No. Anyways, Jane Pierce, I think it's Jane. We're forgetting this. But all that to say is that they'd had 3 children. And by the time the 1852 election rolls on, they'd only had one left, a boy about 10, 12 years old. And Jane had begged her husband to come home, and he did. When the war with Mexico broke out in the 1840s, Frank Pierce signed up. He became an officer, later at the end of the war, a general, and like I said a minute ago, had been decorated for combat. In the election of 1852, Franklin Pierce's campaign is going to let everybody know that he'd won many a hard-fought battle. But one of the problems Franklin Pierce had was that as president, as a man, he always not just won many a hard-fought battle, but the sneering said, yeah, he also won many a hard-fought bottle. Franklin Pierce drank a lot, and he was pit and parcel of the politics of that time period about the Whiskey Republic. Lots of politics will be done in bars and taverns. He was at home there, and so it was that was a part of conflict in the relationship, I think, between Franklin Pierce and his wife. So anyways, he'd gone home. He'd fought in the war. He was out of it. He'd done what his wife had asked him to do. So that when in 1852 the election rolls around, Franklin Pierce goes to his wife and says, honey, I love you. Honey, I have received news that the country wants me, the country needs me to save it. There is a draft Franklin Pierce movement to save the nation from the ills of slavery and the coming sectional crisis. It's already here. They want me. Basically, Pierce takes command. And, honey, I can't do this without you. Honey, if you don't bless this, I'll tell them to go away. I can't do it. But, honey, they're asking me to run for president and save the nation. And Mrs. Pierce basically says to her husband, says, Franklin, if that is true, you have my blessing. But I pray, my husband, that you're not lying to me, and this is an ambition. Because I fear that if it is, and there is ambition here, and you are lying to me, that God will punish us for your ambition. You know what I think. But if you're telling me the truth, and this is a spontaneous draft Frank Pierce movement, well, you have my blessing. Run for president. And so Franklin Pierce assured his wife that everything was fine. and everything was spontaneous. There was no shenanigans in the background, no political shenanigans from old Frank. Well, anyways, long story short was that he gets elected. He wins comfortably because he was that man without a record. He was an attractive man. He was a dapper man. He was a lot of things. He was a good speaker in many respects when he was sober. The fact is that Franklin Pierce was able to become another one of those dark horse candidates. Well, the truth also got out of the bag, too. That draft Franklin Pierce movement that got made up in the Democratic Party wasn't started spontaneously. It wasn't the hand of God or anything like that. It wasn't Franklin Pierce's old friends remembering him and said, you know, Frank would be the guy. But Pierce himself had fanned the flames, had really started the flames through machinations and shenanigans to get himself the nomination, and it got back to Mrs. Pierce. And then Mrs. Pierce confronted her husband with the awful truth, and he more or less said yes. And long story short is that Mrs. Pierce said to her husband, I fear that God is going to punish us. I really fear that he's going to punish us severely for your undue ambition. I don't know how, but he will. So Franklin Pierce maybe brushed it off a little bit and said, well, I'm president-elect, I got to go. And so in, I believe it was February of 1853, Franklin Pierce was leaving out of New Hampshire. And the way the railroads ran in that part of the world, there wasn't a straight line from New Hampshire down to New York City. So Frank Pierce, some more of that stuff there. But Frank Pierce is going to take a circuitous route through upstate New York and eventually down to Washington, D.C. for the inauguration. In upstate New York, there's mountains and there's high hills, sheer cliffs, and so forth. I believe it was in the Adirondacks. It could have been in the Catskill Mountains of upstate New York, around the Finger Lakes. But anyways, the president-elect's train was wandering and wiggling through these mountain passes and up on the side of cliffs, 100-foot cliffs and so on. In the 19th century, far more so than the 20th century, but especially in the early days of railroading could be dangerous even if it was a advanced form of travel. It could be dangerous because of boiler explosions, and it could also be dangerous because of derailments. Not all the track was very good. Well, anyways, the train that's carrying the president-elect derails, and the occupants come tumbling down the side of the mountain, or the side of the hill. It's about a 7,500-foot drop. These are wooden carriages. They should have all been dead, frankly. They all should have been killed or crushed in the derailment. And the president-elect and his wife and their sole remaining son were all thrown from the car. The president-elect hits the ground, as it were, down at the bottom. He kind of reels and comes to, and he looks over, and there's the boy. And the boy is essentially laying in the lap of the mother, who herself had been knocked silly and in shock. And Pierce gathers his wits. It takes his cloak off because he sees the awful truth. And he basically throws the cloak over top of the boy. But before he can do that, his wife comes to, and she sees her son missing half his head. And they have no more kids now. And Mrs. Pierce will tell her husband, essentially in no uncertain terms, that God punished them for his ambition. They took away, the Almighty took away their last remaining son, to clear him of having any responsibilities to save the nation. But the way she says it, you can see that she blames her husband for his ambition, that God had punished him. Now go save the nation. And Franklin Pierce looked at it differently. Yeah, he believed that God punished him, and he was never the same again. In fact, actually, of all the presidents who were sorry before the Civil War, meaning bad, not of any count, I give probably the most pass, in a sense, to Franklin Pierce because of what he's carrying. Franklin Pierce will crawl into the bottom of a bottle after he's president, and he will die of cirrhosis of the liver, which is one of the more ironic ways to die in life, I suppose, is that on the one hand, you drank a lot and your thirst was, quote-unquote, quenched by drinking a lot. Yet when you get cirrhosis of the liver, one of the byproducts of it is that you have unquenchable thirst. And all you call for is water and water and water, and you can't drink enough, and all you do is bloat. because you're retaining water. It's kind of an irony in life, I suppose. But anyways, Franklin Pierce dies of alcohol poisoning after or not alcohol poisoning, alcoholism, cirrhosis of the liver after he leaves the presidency. And he's never the same again. He's a bad president, and he makes mistake after mistake after mistake. I don't want to say that Frank Pierce spent all his time as president weeping and wailing. He doesn't. But at the same time, he was never the same again, and it really, I would argue, shatters him, and more particularly shatters his ability to render good judgment. It's under his watch, and then, of course, James Buchanan's watch, that the events leading to the Civil War accelerate, and the mile markers come closer and closer together. The signposts on the road to the Civil War come closer and faster, and that's where we leave the lecture today, on this sad and melancholy note.